Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning and good afternoon to those joining us from the UK. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we welcome you to the session, The Impact of Design Beyond Objects, for which we have the special participation of Bernard Hay, Jen Bally, and Marisabela de Castro. We will now leave you with Marisabela de Castro. She's an assistant professor in the design department in the School of Architecture, Urbanism, and Design at Universidad del Norte. She works with students in the research of co-creation and design of services and experiences. Professor de Castro will be presenting our guests and moderating the session today. We welcome you all and we remind you to register your questions in the space offered below your screen. Professor Marisabela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Cátedra Europa and to the School of Architecture, Urbanism, and Design, and to our event, The Impact of Design Beyond Objects. The discipline of design has evolved and embedded on different contexts and industries, transforming the way people work, live, and interact with each other. This transformation we know now that goes beyond the development of objects and artifacts. This event seeks to reflect upon design's impact in these contexts and its ability to boost innovation and innovative behavior within all kinds of organizations. Considering that the United Kingdom is the 2021 Cátedra Europa Guest of Honor, we have invited experts from the UK to share their knowledge and experiences embedding design as an innovation strategy. On this occasion, we are pleased to have the participation of Bernard Hay from the Design Council, Dr. Jen Bally from the V&A Museum on Dundee, Dr. Joanna Chuker from the Royal Society of Arts, and Dr. Leon Cruikshank from Imagination Lancaster at Lancaster University, who will be joining us tomorrow. I am pleased to present our first speaker for today, Bernard Hay, who is Lead Design Program Manager for the Design Council. The Design Council has a long history of projects and initiatives which have made a great impact in society's understanding and value of design. We hope that participants of this event will be inspired by the UK's long tradition and experience with this topic. Welcome, Bernard Hay, to Cátedra Europa and to Universidad del Norte.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Marisabela, for the very kind introduction and invitation to speak at this event. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. So let's see if this works. Okay, brilliant. So hopefully you can all see the slides. And what I'd really like to do is to speak with all of you a little bit about Design Council's current research into how design can help us to address the climate crisis. And I've titled that talk, Beyond Objects and Towards New Systems. And so what I'm going to do is to focus on our current research into systemic design. And in the broad sense, what I mean by that is design that consciously affects positive change to wider social, economic, and ecological systems of which it is a part, rather than simply designing isolated products or services that address single problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to our new systemic design framework, which provides a set of tools and approaches that can help support designers to address the climate crisis through their work. I'm then going to share some case studies of examples where we think design is doing some really interesting work to move beyond the approach to solving individual problems to tackling more systemic challenges. And then I'm going to end by saying a little bit about how we can begin to measure the value and impact that this kind of design has on the world, and to share a project that we're currently doing at the moment called Design Economy 2021, which also seeks to adopt a bit of a systemic approach to how we understand the impact of design. But before going into that, I just want to begin with a couple observations and a little bit of background about Design Council. So I think, as everyone on this session probably knows, it's worth noting that design is about so much more than individual products, services, or artifacts. Design plays a key role in determining how we live on the planet and how we live in relationship to each other. And the design theorist Tony Fry captures that idea really well, with the idea that design both shapes the world, but in turn, the design world shapes us back. So the clothing we wear, for example, can reflect our identities and social positions, but also shapes our relationship with natural materials, such as in the project you can see on the left here by Deploy Sustainable Fashion. And the built environments that we inhabit shape our sense of space, our connectivity, and at the same time can either support or exclude other diverse species from inhabiting the spaces that we live in, such as in this wildlife passageway in Holland that runs over a motorway to allow animals to cross the road safely. And even our atmospheric and planetary conditions are shaped by design. Think about the ways in which design-led companies like Octopus Energy are seeking to affect behavior change with consumers to shift them away from fossil fuels to renewable energies through seamless customer experience. So if it's the case that design shapes the world, then we know that it has to reorientate itself to address the climate crisis that's already upon us. So the latest IPCC report claims that in most future scenarios for human beings on the planet, it's looking very likely that our global temperature will exceed a 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade increase within the 21st century, unless we can imminently and urgently reduce our carbon emissions. And that carbon increase and that rise in global temperatures is already being lived, felt, suffered across the world, tied as it is to extreme weather events, flooding, forest fires, and forced migration. And this isn't simply a climate problem, it's also a biodiversity problem. So since the 1970s, we've seen an almost 70% decline in populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. And that's scary not only because of the intrinsic loss of incredible species on this planet, but because of the reliance that we have on biodiversity for resilient farming and food production systems, to have secure natural ecosystems and habitats, and even resilience against global diseases and pandemics. So I wanted to frame this discussion and conversation around design for the climate crisis, because design really has a key role to play in helping us to address this. Research has found that up to 80% of the environmental impact of products and services that we use come from the design stage. And when we think about the urban spaces that we live in, the buildings, the infrastructure such as roads and highways, it's worth noting that about 49% of the carbon that we use comes from the construction industry. And what we see is that a lot of national policies helping us to achieve a reduction in carbon emissions focus on shifting from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. That will only get us around halfway there to achieving a balance of net zero carbon emissions across the planet. So the remaining 45% of change needs to come from the products that we use every day, the food that we consume, and that will require a shift to circular design. So clearly those are big statistics. The urgency is clear, and it follows from that we're going to have to redesign almost every aspect of our lives. So Design Council was set up in 1944, and we're the UK government's National Strategic Advisor on Design. What we do is we undertake research into the nature and value of design. We develop policy work with governments and local authorities to help create the conditions for design to thrive. And we ourselves run design support and training programs that equip businesses and local authorities with the design skills and mindsets that they need to thrive. But our history is also really important. And we were founded, as I said, in 1944 by Sir Winston Churchill's wartime government. And we were labelled at that time as the Council of Industrial Design. And our remit was to promote by all practical means the improvement of design in the products of British industry. And what that really meant was it was about harnessing the potential of design to drive the UK's post-war recovery. So 6 months later, Clement Attlee's government then came to power and promoted us to the Design Council, recognising that design also had a key role to play in promoting social welfare. And I just want to note as well 2 key people in this picture in front of you. So the 2 women on the front, first on the right was Mary Harris, a coat designer who ran 9 factories in the north of England employing 900 people. And on the left was the head of the Housewives Committee. At the time, they were effectively like a modern day consumer group giving feedback on products. And I kind of just wanted to share that history because it's often overlooked in Design Council's time. And since that founding in 1944, over the course of our 70-year history, we've made significant contributions to solving some of the UK's most complex challenges by providing design support, policy recommendations, and tools. But in September of this year, we decided to have a shift in focus, really being struck by the urgency of the climate crisis. And so in September, we announced our new strategy, which is called Design for Planet. And our mission is to galvanise and support the 1.69 million people that work in the UK's design community to design with the welfare of the planet as a priority. And just as a quick side note, for those of you that are interested, we're really excited to be hosting a 2-day online and in-person festival over the 9th and 10th of November. It'll be taking place in the V&A in Dundee in Scotland, which I think Jen will be sharing a little bit more about later, but is also accessible online if any of you would like to join. And you can find out more on designforplanet.org. But where do we think design is most needed to address the climate crisis? Well, there are multiple opportunities and avenues and areas where design can play a role. But I think where we are focusing on at the moment with our work at Design Council is in 3 key areas. And so what I would like to do is to quickly kind of run through those and share 3 vignettes that demonstrate the design's potential to address these issues, but that also set the scene for how we can begin to think about design operating more systemically and holistically beyond individual products or solutions or services. So the first area is the role that design can play in creating sustainable and resilient places, which both allow us to adapt to temperature increase, but as also mitigate it so that we can stay within that 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase. The second is the role that design can play in conserving and regenerating natural resources with circular design and learning from Mother Nature. And the third is the role that design can play in shifting consumer and citizen behaviours by making it easy and attractive to live sustainably. So designers are already doing incredible work to address these issues. And the first project that I want to share was led by a design team that included one of our Design Council experts, Dr. Teo Adebowale. So the city of Salford in the north of England has a long history of flooding. And in 2015, the local council there began to develop a new flood alleviation scheme. Rather than going in and just immediately building a traditional concrete structure, the design team decided to take a more systemic approach to the problem. They went and they engaged with the local communities of the area, they spoke with experts on flooding and climate change, and they understood the wider context in which the project had to operate. And their key insight was that they didn't need to simply create a flood alleviation scheme, but also an asset for the local community. And the resulting idea that they developed was to create an urban wetlands. So the wetlands that you can see in this picture form the heart of the scheme, and it's a great example of using a sort of natural habitat to store water when flooding rises as an increased risk. And not only did that then act as a kind of flood barrier, but it brought additional benefits to the community. It became a park that people could enjoy, that they could exercise in, but also increased biodiversity by creating a new natural habitat and through 10 hectares of wildflower meadow being planted. So the second example that I want to just quickly share relates to that aspiration of design to create more circular and regenerative products, food systems, and services. So Olio was founded by the entrepreneur Tessa Clark, who was struck by the amount of food that was being wasted every day by households around the world. And she wanted to explore how we could design a new service to reduce food waste. So Tessa and the team came up with the idea of a food sharing app called Olio, which effectively would allow neighbours to kind of post unwanted food that they had on this app for other neighbours to basically kind of come and collect it or exchange it for something else. And without knowing it, they quickly found themselves using design to iterate the service. So they did live testing on the app with potential customers. They redesigned it in real time. And they've already begun to have significant impact. So they have around 5 million users now and estimate that they've saved almost 32 million meals from going to landfill. But of course, we also need to create the conditions for citizens to be able to live easy and attractive lives within sustainable boundaries. And that's even true of our financial systems as well. And so I just wanted to share this last project by a technology company called Economy, which was launched in 2018, with the aim of developing a credit card that would help consumers to understand the carbon footprint of their consumption habits. So whereas a credit card would often have a kind of limit on how much money you could spend, this one has a limit on how much carbon the goods and services that you can consume might amount to. And they've now been working with academics to more accurately track emissions. So as the examples show, design clearly has the potential to help us address the climate crisis. But doing so will also require us to design in ways that go beyond a sole consideration of individual products, services, and solutions. And so over the last year and a half, Design Council has been researching into what best practice in design that addresses these challenges looks like, and the values, principles, and frameworks that emerge in that kind of work. And so the insights that I'm going to share in this sort of next session follow from two key reports that we've published this year. So the first is a report called Beyond Net Zero, which was authored by my colleagues Kat Drew, Nat Hunter, and others, and was a piece of UK government-funded research to understand how designers were having positive impact to reduce carbon emissions and consumption. And what came out of those 15 core interviews that formed the backbone of that research was the systemic design framework that I'll share in a moment. And then the second report, which is by Cassie Robinson, Jenny Wildenhall, and Kat Drew, is around how design is evolving to create the systems we need. And so that report really sought to understand what are emerging directions in design and what sort of key insights into good practice in design for climate change. What does that look like? So I think it's often helpful to start understanding what the future or emergent forms of design look like by trying to understand what it's trying to move away from. And through the conversations within that research, we found that designers who were working in this space tended to see themselves as moving against four what we could call dominant characteristics in sort of mainstream design at the moment. And I'm going to quickly introduce these, but before doing so, it's worth noting that these are not intrinsically bad qualities of design. They've been incredibly helpful in design's history, in helping us to benefit people. But the point is that these are perhaps limited characteristics when we start to address kind of complex issues like climate change. So the first dominant characteristic was design's focus on the individual, or what's often referred to as design being a user-centered discipline. So of course, design being focused on the needs, the wants, and the desires of an end user has been incredibly positive. It means that we're designing for the real benefits of individuals rather than for the commercial drivers of organizations and companies. But the limitation is that a focus on individuals prevents us thinking about different kinds of stakeholder that we could be designing for. What happens if the planet becomes our key stakeholder, or a citizen body or a collective? The second was design's relationship with de-risking innovation. So in design management and design thinking, we often saw design was being championed as a way in which you could de-risk innovation. And the way that it would do that is by prototyping, testing, and iterating ideas early with the focus on addressing errors and refining an idea before it was rolled out. And again, the point here is that that is a very valuable strategy, but that too often the interviewees in our research felt that design was used in this way to furnish existing systems rather than offering radical alternatives to the status quo. And then the third kind of current characteristic was that design is often framed as a problem-solving activity. So design is very good at helping you to understand a problem and to then come up with multiple solutions that are then tested before a final one is then rolled out and developed. But the limitation that this focus on problem solving brings is it doesn't help us to have a more open-ended approach to design, which recognizes that really complex challenges like climate crisis are going to require multiple interventions and long-term ongoing engagement rather than being solved in a single project. And that leads to the last of the dominant kind of characteristics, a focus on static solutions. What we tended to find was that a lot of the interviewees said that a lot of the kind of current features of design tend to favor working on a project, completing it, handing it over to a client, and then moving on to the next thing. But the limitation there is that the final design isn't able to adapt and evolve with the changing kind of context, which, when you think about something as complex as climate change, is a really important thing for it to do. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce you to the systemic design framework that kind of came out of that research. And it now underpins much of our own work and our own programs, and we're continuing to evolve it. But in essence, it contains three key areas. The first is 4 characteristics. So these are almost kind of qualities or characteristics that individuals on a project team doing this kind of systemic design need to be able to exhibit and use throughout their work. The second is 6 design principles that can inform and orientate the project from the outset. And then the third is a design framework that helps to guide best practice and structure the design journey. And it's really worth emphasizing that this is not to provide a kind of recipe of how to do systemic design. Different designers and different projects will probably work across these things in different ways. But its aim is to really provide a bit of a scaffold and some initial orientation for designers and non-designers that want to start working in this way. So what we found was that within all of the kinds of really successful systemic design projects that we looked at through those interviews, the teams tended to exhibit these 4 characteristics. These might be 4 different people on a project, but they might also be 4 characteristics that were held by a single person on a project. So the first was that systemic design requires system thinkers. That's someone that has the ability to see how everything is interconnected in a bigger picture and is able to zoom between the micro and the macro within the design project. And so to give an example of what I mean by that, that's the ability of a designer, for example, to both really consider how a service or an intervention affects the direct community or stakeholders that are involved with it, but is also able to think about the wider policy conditions that might be limiting or informing that work, and how it relates to wider technological and environmental shifts. The second characteristic was that it was about using design to test, iterate, and propose radically new ideas. And so it required someone who understands the power of design and innovation tools and has the technical and creative skills to make these things happen and puts them to use early on in the work. The third thing was it really required leaders and storytellers. So someone who is able to tell a great story about what might be possible, to create that hopeful vision at the start of the project that would get others to buy into it, and was able to communicate why this was important and to drive a project through to completion. And then the last thing is that because these issues are so complex, it was vital that multiple perspectives were brought into the project, but that also relationships were built with other people working within similar areas or similar issues was supported throughout and around a project that was taking place. And so what was really needed was connectors and conveners, people who are really good at building relationships and can create spaces where people come together from different backgrounds to join the dots and create a bigger movement for change. So we found that 6 principles were also really important to guide this work. So the first one really seeks to kind of move us away from the focus on the individual to being people and planet centered. So how can design focus the shared benefits, not only for individuals, but for all living things, and also communities, citizens, and stakeholders understood more collectively? Secondly, as I've already mentioned, it's vital that multiple perspectives are brought into this kind of work, given their complexity, but also the multiple people that they affect. And so the second principle is about being inclusive and welcoming of difference, creating safe and shared spaces and language where different voices can be brought into the design process and trust be built with multiple stakeholders. As I mentioned previously, the ability to zoom in and out from the immediate context of a problem to its wider context within social, technological, and policy shifts was also really key. And as I'll say a little bit more about in some of the case studies that follow, design being able to operate on those multiple levels was also crucial to this kind of work. How can design, for example, create a new community space or a new way of learning while simultaneously affecting policy change at a national level, for example? Fourth was kind of getting beyond the idea of the designer as being bounded by or focused on a single project. So really building their work towards a bigger movement for change and a larger hopeful vision. And central to that is about collaborating and connecting. So seeing your project as one element in a wider movement for change. Fifth was about using design skills to prototype, speculate, imagine, build different ideas and possibilities for how something could be realized in the world. It's about making things to see how they work and to help more things emerge. And then lastly, being circular and regenerative. And the shift here is rather than a fixation on trying to imagine something from nothing, to really focus on the existing assets around a project. Those might be physical things like existing natural resources, but they also might be things like social values and behaviors and capabilities. So the question there is, how can we always reuse, nurture, and grow what is already there, rather than simply starting from scratch? So people tend to like a process, and so we looked at the design processes behind some of the projects of those that we interviewed, and we broke it down into different elements. And so as you can see from the circle, it's not necessarily a linear journey from left to right, but it does seek to move you forward from a kind of vision and a set of values to action. And it's also worth noting as well that this systemic design framework is not entirely new, but it builds on our previous frameworks, the double diamond model and the framework for innovation. And if any of you are interested in finding out more about these, you can find all of them online on the Design Council website. So what are some of the key kind of ingredients or parts of that framework? So the first is that this really is about encouraging deep and wide thinking. And it starts with the notion of convergent thinking. So that idea of kind of being able to take many different ideas and refine them down to the most important one. And divergent thinking, which is kind of going the other way, having multiple perspectives and approaches to an issue. And the key point here is in that kind of first diamond, or that starting point of a project. It's really about emphasizing that before you jump into designing a solution, you need to do a lot of upfront research into the issue you think you're addressing. That's not simply about reading loads of data and reports, but as all of you know, it's about spending time with people to experience the issue through multiple perspectives, understanding that wider context, and listening to different voices and types of expertise. And the point is that that allows you to reframe the brief before you get to continue, and to think about the issue more systemically. As I've been saying, zooming in and out is a crucial part of the framework. Systemic design is about being able to operate on multiple scales throughout the process. So, for instance, how does a project relate to those directly affected by it, whether there be local communities or a particular business or a place? But then how does it relate to wider shifts in national policy or environmental change? And that ability to move across scales allows us to identify wider opportunities, impact, but also unforeseen consequences and issues. Part of the reason and the driving force for developing this new framework was about getting design to really address root causes of problems, not just tinkering at the edges of a system. And often that process of kind of digging deep into the root cause of the problem helps to realize that the issues tend to not be necessarily technical or physical, but can often be invisible. They can be things like cultural mindsets, beliefs, issues of governance and regulation. And again, that's why it's so important with this kind of work to invest resource, whether that's time, money, and expertise, at the start of a project to reframe the brief and to really understand what change in the system needs to happen to have a positive impact. That might be the design process, but so often the really important impact through design comes from the invisible things that happen around design itself. And these are too often not properly resourced or considered within design projects, but they are vital investments. So before a project even starts, creating and sharing a hopeful vision with your team and wider stakeholders is really vital. How can you start with values that everyone actually subscribes to and use this to inform your work going forward? Equally, building trust and relationships was a really vital thing for this kind of work. How can you bring in multiple perspectives into the design process to design with different communities and actors, but also build those relationships so that further change can continue after an individual project? Leadership and storytelling, as I've already discussed, is a crucial part of those two things: creating a vision, encouraging self-reflection, and getting buy-in to that wider systemic change. And then think about the legacy of the projects as well. How is a project going to continue to live on and evolve and change over time after the designer's initial work is done? How is it going to be shared and used with others to incentivize them to join you on this bigger journey for change? And really, that's about seeing the work of designers on individual projects as being part of a longer and collaborative journey. So what I want to kind of shift to now is to share a few case studies that really emphasize how design is moving away from those current mainstream characteristics. How is design being collective, transformative, possibility-giving, and enabling dynamic conditions? And to do that, I want to share 4 of the case studies that were shared in that previous report mentioned earlier, that all exhibit different qualities and approaches to doing systemic design. So the first example that I want to share is a project called Public Kitchen, which was designed by Kenneth Bailey, Laurie Lobenstein, and the team at the Design Studio for Social Intervention in Boston, USA. And their starting point was to question the assumption that all of us need to have an individual kitchen, and the food system and culture that then emerges around that within the USA. So clearly, in other cultural contexts, the idea of a communal kitchen is a mainstay, it's a common thing. But in the US, it's often associated with poverty or homelessness. And the individual kitchen is seen as the primary domestic space where personal food production could take place. But the crucial thing was that they didn't just question this assumption around how food should be made and consumed. They proposed an alternative and created a public kitchen in the same way that you might have a library. And over the course of the week, this public kitchen hosted over 500 community members. So the point here was that it acted as a kind of proposition for something new. And what they did was they didn't simply serve food in the space, they also used it as a platform for a series of talks and conversations between food activists, policymakers, local government and citizens, and food businesses. They both showed how a public kitchen could work, but also how it might rearrange other aspects of the food system, and it sparked further ideas which could support and reinforce it. What different kinds of delivery modes might happen around food if this was the case, that we had a public kitchen? How might that then extend to thinking about new ways of growing food? And also, what kinds of childcare possibilities, for example, are opened up by having a communal kitchen rather than a private space? So for me, this is a great example of a systemic design project that is designed for a collective. Think about all of those different people that are involved in that project, and is about giving a new possibility for a radically new, different kind of system, in this case, a food system. So the second example I want to share is the King's Cross in Sydney. And the project here was led by Kees Dorst and a team at the Designing Out Crime Research Centre. So in 2010, the King's Cross area of Sydney had a big problem with alcohol-related night crime. And the public authorities had tried everything that they would usually do to try and reduce this. They'd introduced banning orders, they'd had more police on the streets, they'd enforced earlier closing hours on the local businesses. But they found that this wasn't having the desired effect. And so they brought in Kees Dorst and his design team to dig deep into the underlying values and assumptions that shaped that current system. So the designers spent a lot of time with the different communities involved in the space and tried to understand the mental frames and values they were holding. And what they found was that there was a focus in that space around crime prevention, safety, and security. And what they sought to do was to redesign the deep code of that space by reimagining the values that would orient and shape all of the behavior in that area. And they asked the area to try and create a thriving nightlife, and asked them to imagine what it would be like if this was treated as an amazing music festival. And suddenly, that shift in values and mindsets opened up all sorts of opportunities. So nightclub owners became collaborators, food stalls were put on, there were spaces developed for unconscious sobering, and it even in fact led to a wider global movement of night mayors around the world. So people that are really there to kind of champion and celebrate the nightlife of cities. However, this is also a story that has a cautionary tale, because after this kind of reimagining of this space took place, a couple of young men died in the area, and the doctors that were caring for them went on the media and kind of announced around the need to kind of go back to a kind of stop crime approach in the space. So they changed the narrative back to the area. And it's a really key lesson there on making sure that you involve all of the stakeholders that you need to in that reframing of the values from the start to ensure that it has lasting change. So the third example I want to share really is about addressing the housing system. And this was developed by a founder of an organization called WikiHouse, called Alistair Parvin, whose work really began with the question of why is it that wealthy countries continue to have housing crises? So what he did was he began to map the complex drivers behind this issue and found that they were a result of a historically entrenched stack of systems around how houses are produced and the knowledge that's needed to sort of certify housing, systems around regulation and also land ownership and rights as well. And so in response, Alistair and his team at the Open Systems Lab started to look for leverage points within these systems where small interventions could affect the wider systems in which they were a part. And a great example is the WikiHouse project, which really at its heart aimed to make the ability to build healthy, zero-carbon homes available to every citizen, community, and business. And really at its heart, it was about democratizing access to knowledge and capabilities that are historically locked in the hands of specialists, in this case, architects and planners and regulators. And really, it's a great example of where you can kind of create this intervention within a system and allow something new to begin to emerge in parallel to an existing system. And it's also itself sparked other projects, such as a project called Plan, that aims to make the planning system more accessible and transparent to citizens, and Fairhold, a project that aims to allow families or communities to own their own homes at an affordable price. And so you can see that this is a great example of creating dynamic conditions. It's an ongoing project with multiple interventions like WikiHouse that enables to fundamentally transform the housing systems that we rely on. And so the last example that I want to share is really focused on the work of dark matter laboratories. And it asks how we can begin to reimagine trees less as physical assets in a city, but as co-inhabitants of the city. So trees used to cover many areas where urban cities are now stretched, but over the last couple of centuries, urban planners have seen them as being at best isolated physical units, and as at worst things that just damage foundations and pavements. And this narrow attitude or way of conceptualizing trees leads to really harmful consequences. And a great example of that is what happened to the city of Sheffield in 2018, where 5,400 trees were cut down because the financial costs of maintenance and insurance were seen to outweigh the social and ecological benefits that urban planting brought to the city. So the way in which dark matter laboratories work is propositionally. So they've set out a series of visual proposals of how a new relation to trees could be realized within cities and at a legislative level, including designing a model for new forest infrastructure, which really asks, how could we maybe measure the success of a city from how well the ecosystems are maintained, rather than just how many trees are planted or cut down and the costs required to maintain them? But one of their real strengths is realizing that this isn't simply a project that seeks to redesign legislation and policy, but it also has to enter into the behaviors and the cultural values and mindsets that citizens have as well. How can design enable us to change human perception and increase empathy with trees so that they are seen collectively as co-inhabitants of the city. And Indy Johar shared a great example of where that was happening in Melbourne called Hello Tree, which is a design intervention that allows you to send emails to trees that you care about in the city. So threading through these examples, I think, is a way of seeing and beginning to understand the shift to a new language for design. And it's deliberately there to be slightly unfamiliar and slightly alternative as a way of encouraging that shift to that new kind of practice. So how can we shift from a focus on the individual as designers to collectives or the planet? How can we shift from being agile and de-risking innovation to being transformative and radically suggesting new possibilities? How can we move away from focusing on solving a single problem to opening up possibilities that others can take forward through their work? And how can we shift from a focus on static solutions to creating dynamic conditions that can evolve over time to address the complex challenges that we seek to face? So for the last part of this talk, I then want to say a little bit about, well, how can we start to capture the wider impact that design of this kind and design more generally has? How, in other words, can we capture the social, environmental, and economic impact of design? And I'm going to share a current research project that we're undertaking in Design Council as a way of bringing out some key points around this, but also because I hope it starts to share a little bit about how we're starting to think about our own research in a more systemic way in the spirit of some of the projects that I've shared. So pretty much as far back as there has been the Design Council, we've been doing research for government, for businesses, for designers that really seeks to understand the economic value of design and the scale and scope of the design economy. So how many people work in design? What kinds of disciplines do they work in? How does design benefit innovation and productivity? And our last report, Design Economy 2018, and also Designing a Future Economy, which was published in 2017, really, I think, provided for us the most comprehensive picture of the economic value of design to the UK. And so some of the stats and the facts that we found through that research was that the design economy in 2016 generated 85.2 billion in GVA to the UK. To give a sense of scale, that's about 75% of what the financial sector in the UK generates each year, which is quite frankly huge. We also found that it's a huge source of employment and skills and expertise, with 1.69 million people working across the design economy in the UK, 1.3 million of whom were professional designers or architects. And those people were further employed in around 78,000 design firms. Within that 1.69 million people working across the design economy, though, when you start to consider the role that design skills play in the economy, where those skills might not necessarily be used by designers, the figures become even bigger. So we found in Designing a Future Economy that at least 2.5 million people in the UK use design skills in their day-to-day work. So that tells you a lot about the economic and financial value of design. And there's a huge amount of evidence to show that design drives productivity, it boosts innovation, it leads to economic growth. But over the last 18 months, there's been a resurgent interest in expanding the kinds of value that we look to in decision-making when we think about the value of design. They have tended to focus on the social and environmental benefits that design can bring. And there are a huge wealth of interesting frameworks and impact assessment tools that have been developed in recent years to start to capture those values. And I think when you start to think about a challenge like the climate crisis and some of those projects that we have just kind of gone through, it's really clear that if you want to understand the impact of design in those spaces, you need to make visible the often invisible benefits that design brings, whether that's about building new relations, promoting people's health and well-being, or thinking about the wider impact that design has on biodiversity loss or carbon emissions. And so part of the driver for thinking more holistically about value through our research as we go forward is that it's about opening up a wider set of considerations for when we decide what kinds of design to do and what kind of impacts we want to have, but also a way of really being able to advocate and champion for design, which really captures the more holistic value that it's bringing. So think back again to that Salford Wetlands project. Yes, this also has economic benefits for the area. It protects properties. It creates a desirable place for people to live, probably boosting sort of housing value. But it also promotes people's health and well-being through being a park, providing access to green space, and environmental benefits such as biodiversity. So how can we start to capture the value of design from a social, environmental, and economic perspective? Well, the first thing to say is that within our work at Design Council, we recognize that design activity happens across the whole of the economy. It's carried out by designers and architects across multiple disciplines, but also requires support staff that help designers to do their work. And as I mentioned, workers that are using design skills to a significant part in their day-to-day life. And what we started to do with this next iteration of design economy is to take a step back to ask, well, what is the real value that we're trying to measure? What impact does design actually have? And whereas we tend to often think of value as being something objective, so, economics, you can kind of get data that shows you how much profit is made by a design or, what the GVA contribution is. We really wanted to start with the idea that value is something subjective. It's defined as what is the significance of a change to different stakeholders. Or in other words, what kinds of change does design bring about that people affected by it take to be the most important ones? And for us, that really has a kind of key implication for how you assess the impact of design. It means that at the start of a project, when you ask what kinds of impacts and outcome you want to get through a project, you need to involve diverse stakeholders who are affected by it to ask them what are the values and impacts that they think are most important for this design to realize and most important to measure success against. Within design economy, taking that more systemic approach also means that we need to look in different places where design is being used. And so, as I've mentioned, we'll look at its economic and social environmental value, but we'll also be looking at how businesses, public sector organizations, and communities are using design within their own work. And we're at a really exciting point in that project in that we're just about to start running a series of deliberative workshops with people across the design economy to ask them to tell us what they take to be valuable impacts that design is having, so that we can then build the data and the evidence to showcase it. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be undertaking a national programme of research that will help us to understand the current and future value of design to the UK, but really then thinking about how we turn that into usable tools and insight for different actors across design. And so we'll be curating a digital platform with new data, evidence, and stories for people to use across the design economy. And we'll be supporting that through a programme of events, workshops, and campaigning to bring those different actors together. So in that systemic lens, to create those relationships. And what we hope that that research will then do is to operate at multiple levels within the design system in the UK. We hope it'll be able to provide policy recommendations for national and local government so that we can create the right enabling conditions for design to thrive in the UK. We hope that it will help to inform businesses and public sector organisations who are commissioning designers to commission the right kind of design and to feel empowered to do so. And we hope that it will provide designers and architects with evidence that they can use to push for good quality design, but also with tools and methods that they can use to assess their own impact with communities that they are working with. And so the platform is now up and running. We've shared our initial bits of research that we've been running over this year. And here are just a few screenshots of that work. And you can find it on designeconomy.co.uk. But I'd really recommend having a look at it, having a look at some of the resources and tools that we're already starting to gather. But this will continue to evolve and grow over the next couple of years. And so just to kind of conclude, I wanted to share with you all maybe a few places that you could start within your own design work to start to design for planet and for these more complex systemic issues. So the first, how can you start to design for planet, to see it as a user or even more as a co-designer rather than simply design for individuals? What values and characteristics are you going to assemble in your team around a project? How are you going to make sure that there are storytellers, connectors, designers, and others that can help you to achieve your ultimate vision? What is the wider impact you want to realize through your design? And how are you going to involve people in a deliberative process to identify what really matters and the methods that you're going to use to capture it. How can you design the legacy of your project so it's open to change and evolve and can help and inspire others to orient their work to that bigger positive vision? And lastly, how can you create a platform where different types of people can come together to design in this kind of way? And so I'm just going to end with this final quote, which comes from the economist Kate Raworth through the conversations that we've been having around our new strategy. So if you are not designing for planet, what planet are you on? All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard, for your presentation. It was very, very inspiring. I'm sure everyone here feels the same way. Just to make sure that everybody in the audience knows that they can send their questions either in English or Spanish, and we can have Bernard answer them. So while you think of them and you write them down, I have one for you while we wait a little bit. And I think everyone will agree with me that here in Latin America, especially in Colombia, we are I would say, a lot of years behind the UK in terms of the position that design is in. And I think it's very inspiring, but also it's kind of daunting to think about how behind we are in that sense. So what would you recommend? What would be the place to start? I mean, we're just beginning to try to embed design as an innovation booster, and we're trying to make design an important part of decision making in policy and in all kinds of aspects and industries. So what would you recommend for contexts that are so behind from the UK and from what you guys have learned so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the big things that we kind of do at Design Council is it's really, and I think it's in some ways probably, a challenge with overlaps is, how do we build visibility and understanding of what design actually is? And one of the challenges that we often face when we go and we talk to businesses or local authorities is that design is often seen as a kind of aesthetic or something that you do at the end of an innovation process to make it look nice and get people to buy it. And so I think in a way, really it's that communication journey. Like, how do you get people to buy into this new and more richer vision of what design is so that they can invest in it, support it, I think is really key. And I think one of the things that we find that's really powerful with doing that, well, two things. I think the first of all is kind of really celebrating and amplifying examples of where great design has happened and really having the evidence to demonstrate the impact it's had. Okay. And the second thing I think as well is really thinking about how you can translate design into kind of accessible terms. And, often designers use a lot of technical terminology, and, I've done that myself in the talk that I just shared, but really trying to find the kind of common language that you have and that you can use. And that's kind of why at Design Council for us, the frameworks are actually really important, because often, when we're working with non-designers, having those kinds of visual representations of what design is and what a journey through design looks like just really helps to kind of orientate people into what we're doing and to kind of start to get into that mindset a bit. And I think that that's a really crucial thing, that, if you want to affect that kind of more cultural shift in what design is, it's about changing understanding and kind of mindsets around design.
Great, thank you. I do have another question. I have a lot, so if you don't mind. You said that there was a shift from the mindset from going from static solutions to more dynamic solutions, and that meant that the designer was not only hired to do a specific job and then leave it there and go somewhere else. So how's the job market changed in the UK in that sense? I mean, have you seen that designers are now having more permanent roles within industries and not going from one project to the other? Have you measured anything related to that?
So that's a really interesting question, and it's one of the things that we're really hoping to look at in our next version of Design Economy. So we're just at the moment about to start our analysis of, what's the relationship of number of people working in freelance contracts in design, for example, versus permanent contracts. And I think it's worth acknowledging that, the reality is that, a lot of designers work for organizations. The projects that you work on are largely set by companies and organizations. But I would say on a personal note that I do think that you can see pockets of change happening within design. I think one thing that we're seeing is that designers are being a lot more kind of values-led in the work they're doing, and they're advocating for the kinds of change that they want to see in the world as well. So, for example, in the UK, we've recently had an activist or organization initiative called Architects Declare, where architects have been coming together to advocate for more policy, more regulation that encourages architects to work more sustainably. And I think, at the same time, we're also seeing, examples of really incredible design organizations that are addressing these more long-term systemic challenges and visions as well. So, examples in the talk, the WikiHouse project by Alistair Parvin. I mean, they've been working for a number of years on that really big challenge. And, how can we change the housing system? And looking then strategically for where there might be individual projects that they can do that all sort of join up to addressing that more systemic challenge. So I think it's like having that big vision as well and that big ambition for your work and asking what projects and things that you can do within that vision to move things forward, I think is a big thing in this as well.
Thank you. And well, since I know there are a lot of colleagues around here, and since we're teaching students as well, so I was wondering how can we teach those new skills, those 4 specific skills that you said that were key right now to tackle design issues. So what would you say it's very important, or how can we foster those characteristics in our design students?
Yeah, that's a great question, and again, something that we're currently thinking about at the moment with our own projects too. And I think the first thing is really about how can we as educators kind of start to model some of those behaviors ourselves and create spaces where the students themselves are also allowed to kind of model and test and develop those things. So, for example, with storytelling, and I think this is this is not going to be new stuff. I think this is happening in design schools already. How do you give space for students to be kind of really presenting and championing and pitching their work, for instance? With the kind of relationship building, how do you create a space in the classroom which is really encouraging students to kind of be sharing knowledge and ideas, to be having a peer-to-peer dialogue and modeling that inclusive and welcoming space? And similarly with those kinds of values, really simple things as well as actually just like how can you invite students to be thinking about what are the collective values that you as a learning group bring to the seminar or the session or your interested designers, and modeling some of that behavior as well. So I think for me, it kind of starts there, like, how can we kind of create this as this space for these values and these ideas to actually be realized within the space of education before it's even necessarily taken out of the classroom into working with communities. And I think the last thing to say as well is, I do think, a lot of this work is about kind of complex systemic change. This is about working with different communities. This is often working at sometimes quite tricky and kind of complicated issues. And I think that's really, a space where we really need as design educators to think about how can we really introduce more reflexive design ethics and encourage design students to feel confident in using more ethical mindsets and skills in their work as well. And I think it's an area that we're really interested in, and something that I would also love to hear from others in terms of how you're doing that in your work.
Okay, great. We have a question from the audience. It says, how would the vision of design industry change in third world countries such as Colombia? Yeah, I think you said a little bit about that. I don't know if you want to add something about it. I think it relates to how we can have that vision and how does it change from a developed context such as the UK from developing countries such as Colombia.
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, and I feel it's sort of hard as well to kind of give a fixed answer from over here in the UK. And I think for me it kind of goes back to thinking about what change is possible within your immediate parameter as a designer. And some of the projects that I kind of shared in my talk are kind of really big kind of national policy changes. Thinking about WikiHouse changing legislation around housing, for example. But also it can be a really small thing as well. And actually it can just be about involving your immediate communities or different stakeholders in that journey. And I think for me, it kind of goes back to that point around sort of working with what's already there what values, opportunities, ideas are already in a design, in the context of your design, and growing things up from the bottom up rather than the top down.
Okay. We have another one. It says, here in Colombia, one of our challenges is to cluster design industry. So what would you recommend for designers to come to agreements as a professional guild?
Ooh, that's a really hard question. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really tricky question, and within the UK we have sort of different design bodies. So, for example, we have the RIBA, which is the Royal Institute for British Architects, a membership body for architects, a national body. We have things like the Design Business Association, which is for design businesses. But one of the things that we don't have is a kind of cross-disciplinary body for design. So it tends to be very sector and discipline focused. And I think as well, again, for me, it's about conversation and dialogue. I think it's about getting people together, what sort of shared values and interests are within the design communities, and how can you build something from there rather than a kind of top-down thing. And I've also noticed that I think, Leon shared Chartered Society of Designers is another great example.
And he also asks, what mistakes did the UK make that could be avoided in the development design in Colombia?
Yeah, God, that's a tough question as well. I think it's sort of hard to, kind of pick out a single thing. I mean, I would say that for us, the big kind of remaining challenge is about building visibility for design. And, I think that, there's kind of key spaces where that needs to happen, not least in sort of education. So within the UK, we've seen since about 2010 a significant decline in take-up in secondary schools of design and technology as a subject of study. And that obviously then has knock-on effects for pipeline of designers and skills and expertise in design within the wider economy and the workforce. And so I think for me that actually that's a really important place to start, which is like, how can you actually empower citizens and young people at an early age to become excited and inspired by design, and to also build their skills and capability from an early age as well. And I think that's such an important ingredient for having a really strong design culture, but one that I think is very often overlooked. So I would say, yes, that engaging young people, thinking about the education pipeline, but really from early years, for me is a really important thing to consider.
Okay. And we have the last one. It says, what kind of roles do you consider the stakeholders can assume in order to generate disruptive or radical innovation by design in a systemic level?
Yeah, so I think that this really varies from project to project. And I have to say as well that sometimes in my own work, I wonder whether stakeholder is quite the right word to use to describe people who are designing with us in the projects. But I would say that, as much as possible, this is about trying to shift away from the idea that the designer is the expert, consulting the community and asking what are the things you want, and then going away and then designing the solution, to actually involving them as equal experts with lived experience, and as themselves kind of co-designers in that project as well. And so for me, that's what I love about projects like the Public Kitchen project that I shared in the presentation. Whilst that was initiated by a design team, actually the intervention relied on various different experts coming in, sharing food, talking in the space, taking those ideas forward. And then the last thing as well to say on that is, I think it's worth recognizing that design is often really done most effectively by non-designers. And so we did a piece of research last year at Design Council called Design Differently, which was looking at how communities, people that didn't necessarily describe themselves as non-designers, were using design tools and methods to deal with the challenges of COVID-19. And we found amazing examples of people, converting pubs into, community hubs and community spaces, thinking about local food production and food exchange, things that could reduce waste as well. And again, I think there's also something as well about kind of shifting away from the focus on design as a term. I think it can sometimes be quite an excluding kind of language as well. And how you can kind of start to engage with what communities and stakeholders are already doing that's incredibly creative, and work from that rather than imposing your own kind of conception of what design is.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Bernard, for sharing your contribution with us. I think it's been really interesting. and very insightful for everyone here. I thank you once again, and well, welcome again to Universidad del Norte and to Cátedra Europa. You are welcome to come back whenever you want to.
Oh, thank you so much. No, it's been an absolute pleasure, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of the session. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, now I am pleased to present our second speaker for today, Dr. Jen Bally, Research Manager for the V&A Museum in Dundee in Scotland. Dr. Bally will present her talk called Design Thinking for Tomorrow's World. And thank you, Dr. Bally, and welcome to Cátedra Europa and to Universidad del Norte.
Thank you so much, Maria Isabella, for a lovely introduction. Just going to share my screen just now, get those slides ready. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and to speak to you today. So I'm Jen Bally, I'm Research Manager at V&A Dundee. We are a design museum in Scotland, and we're also a national design centre. Today, I'm going to talk to you about V&A Dundee and our role as this National Design Centre for Scotland. I'll also talk about our Design for Business programme, which is a national design-led training programme with a design thinking accelerator, where we are currently delivering remotely online. I'll also share an overview of 5 projects, all unique in their design, scope and purpose, but connected by adopting a design-led approach to respond to complex problems. Now, these problems vary from health and social care to climate change and build upon all of the wonderful insights that Bernard shared on the work of the Design Council. Other challenges address social isolation and loneliness, social justice and the role of design in architecture and placemaking, and rethinking our local communities. Before I get started, this is a bird's eye view of our museum at the waterfront in Dundee in Scotland. And this mural was co-designed by Cobalt Collective, working to a commission titled Thinking Out Loud, with a mural inside and outside of the museum. Now, Thinking Out Loud is about opening up conversations about what design means and sparking debate and ideas about the role of design in enriching our lives. Part of the remit of this commission was also to challenge equality, diversity and inclusion, and to ensure that people have their voice truly heard, and also to develop interactive spaces inside, outside and around the museum. By using the plaza as a civic space for the public to enjoy, and also co-designing this civic space through a series of workshops with different community groups. Our new director, Leonie Bell, talks about the museum having roots out into our city and being a hub that connects into the local ecosystem. And moving forward, as we transition to becoming a national centre for design, alongside being a design museum, this will have a really important role and be a networked mechanism. And it will also be an important role working nationally for facilitating partnerships and using design as a mechanism to address complex problems right across the country. Now, what do I mean by complex problems? Complex problems are often referred to as wicked or sticky problems. These are big, bold, complex challenges that are deeply rooted. They have no simple fix or solution, and they're often described as wicked or sticky problems. And these problems are much more complex. They have interconnected relationships. There are different touch points and multiple end users connected to them. But essentially, they can't be solved in isolation. Without a diverse team and without different skill sets, specialist knowledge, but most importantly, without having people at the heart of them to share their point of view. Victor Papanek talks about designers, or the ability of designers solving problems in parts of society where there aren't designers. And building upon some of the work that Bernard shared, the shift from the designers no longer being seen or known as just aesthetic finishers of ideas. So the toolbox needs to be a lot broader, and design thinking or design-led approaches provide a way of working, they support a new mindset, and they provide us with an approach or a set of methods to start to work through complexity and complex problems. This might vary from health and social care to addressing the climate crisis to working on social justice. And this is about empowering everyday people and enabling them to play a really key part in designing their life and their community. But this also comes with a responsibility for a designer or a design thinker or those crafting, facilitating, or leading such processes. This requires setting up safe spaces for all users to have a voice, but also to take a responsibility to ensure that that voice is listened to, that it's valued and acknowledged to play a really pivotal part in crafting solutions as the design process evolves and moves forward. Through our Design for Business programme at V&A Dundee, we often talk about the spirit of design thinking and the mindset that is required to adopt that as an approach, a practice, a profession, or a way of working. And we use these 5 core principles to frame any session, any training, any workshop, or any project. And it's essentially about always questioning, creating safe spaces to allow people to ask questions at any part of a project, a programme, or training programme or a process. It's about being people-centred and always having people at the heart of that process to ensure that their voice is valued, that it's heard, and that it's a democratic process that gives all voices a platform. It's also about communicating creatively and adopting design principles to often visualise or synthesise complex information to make it clearer, more accessible, and to translate it to different audiences in different ways. It's also about collaborating and co-creating. So again, it's no longer a designer working in isolation, but adopting a collaborative approach to build teams, to work with diverse skill sets, and to facilitate meaningful ways for those different skill sets to combine and to flourish by working together. And finally, it's all about iteration. So testing very early on in any project and adopting that mantra of make, test, learn as we evolve through projects and we work together. So this is a snapshot from one of our training sessions. For our Design for Business programme at V&A Dundee, we work with 2 senior design associates, Jonathan Ball and Catherine Docherty. And I believe Jonathan is also a colleague of Bernard's. He's done a lot of work with the UK Design Council, and Catherine's done a lot of work with Nesta in the UK and the British Council. They have over 2 decades of experience delivering design-led business support and training programs all over the world. And we've built up our Design Thinking Accelerator over the last 5 years. And over that time, we've engaged with over 1,000 professionals from over 800 different organisations, all varied in scale from startups to global corporates to the public sector and to local authorities. And through our Design Thinking Accelerator, we use this to provide training into the fundamentals of design thinking. We do reference the Design Council's Double Diamond and their more recent model, and we use this as a framework for innovation, and we programme different methods and approaches working through that double diamond to build key building blocks to allow people to start to question a challenge, frame a challenge, question the challenge. Big organisations like IDEO have popularised these design thinking methods and approaches, and often using the term design thinking, we find this is a recognised term that people are already familiar with. It's been challenged, it's been contested, there's healthy discourse around it. But also there's no chance that these challenges are going to argue around the importance of mainstreaming it or popularising it, is that it's really important to ensure that these deeply rooted systemic, societal, climate-related challenges are taken up by designers, that designers can get out and work in these communities, but also empower communities or different user groups to play a pivotal part in starting to work collaboratively through those societal or climate-orientated challenges. And the commonality is that there is need for support. We found that through our alumni and our programme over the last 5 years, often the organisations or the individuals that we're engaging with are often in need for support, and they value this design-led training to support them in framing and articulating their problem, their challenge, or their proposition. I think the challenge with design thinking is that there's a lot of ambiguity around it. Often projects are a little bit fuzzy at the front end, and I think that we've found that the methods or the approaches work as a series of building blocks to allow people to start to unpack that problem, to walk through the problem and to understand it in different ways, but also to test out any assumptions and to validate it, really importantly, by going out and talking to people to get really important information to build up that proposition or frame that challenge in a really more meaningful and robust way moving forward. Design thinking also is challenged in the sense that post-it notes have become the icon for design thinking, and we need to be really careful that we move beyond sticky notes. It isn't enough to just have an idea. You have to know how to hone your idea, how to craft your idea, how to shape your idea, and how to understand the network of the organizations, the public space, whether it's the business culture, to really push your idea or your proposition through and to bring it to life. You need to be able to sell that idea to get buy-in and support from key decision makers to really galvanize the support around it moving forward. And that's really hard. We often talk about working through the double diamond, that you have we talk about the challenge being in the middle and taking a step back to do that discovery work that's really important. You define your problem, you come through, and this is one of our alumni at the end of a design thinking accelerator presenting an idea framer to pitch their idea. But there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done beyond that part of the process in building a culture around it in your team, training up other members, or perhaps it's commissioning designers to come in and support. So we recognise that design thinking and training around design thinking is one part to starting to work through these complex problems, but there is a commissioning piece beyond that, and there's an aftercare model that is really required to provide follow-up mentoring, coaching, further design-led business support. And that also feeds into some of the work that Bernard mentioned around evaluation, that's also really important to start to capture the impact around it and to craft really meaningful stories to further support, to attract follow-on funding, and to make time and to build resources around a project. So practice in design thinking is around creative confidence and leaping into the unknown. So it is about being comfortable with ambiguity, but also looking for opportunities to increase the scope and scale of design. It's not simply easy to be satisfied with the idea because you have an idea. So it's about really using the tools and approaches to build robust data around your idea to support, follow-on support, and to build resource around it. And true masters of design thinking have confidence in their solutions by leaping into the unknown and building solutions at scale. So this is back to the mindset piece. The idea of mastery is crucial to design thinking, and it can take years and years of practice to be truly deep and good at crafting design solutions that are as multifaceted as they need to be. For example, they move from production through to manufacture. That's changing now with AI and all of the new software development. So how do these ideas face and travel through the world? And then holding on to this final point that design thinking is never finished. So what does good look like? Having these really robust design stories that we can point to that demonstrates what good looks like, that gives us this aspiration to push towards and to challenge and to question. And this can't be achieved from a half-day workshop or a series of workshops. It's very much about an ongoing journey, and it might also be after that journey and building that awareness and advocacy within a team. It could be about commissioning design, buying in those skills, or investing in further training and support. Within our Design for Business programme, we're also partners in the Global Design Thinking Alliance, which was founded by Die School in Potsdam in Germany. There are 27 partners from across the world, and it's a platform for knowledge exchange, for debate, for collaboration and exploration around the best practices in design thinking, education, training, and research. So that's a really great network because we're often learning, and I think our role as a design museum is not about reinventing the wheel and producing new resources or tools. It's about signposting good practice and good, well-established and tested design methods, resources that we can point people to. So I'm now going to talk about 4 examples from our alumni, all working on big and complex problems and all using design thinking to develop strategy, new innovation and impact at scale. So the first, Glasgow City Council are our very first alumni from the first Design Thinking Accelerator we ran in 2017. They have recently been shortlisted in 50 finalists for the Bloomberg Global Innovation Mayors Challenge. So they're one of 50 cities across the world who've been shortlisted, and they've had this 4-month pilot period to do some testing around the city. And towards the end of this month, they go into the next round to compete for $1 million. Now, Glasgow are focusing, they've got this fantastic Centre for Civic Innovation, where they're using design and big data and training up local citizens to respond to some of the city's biggest challenges. More than a quarter of the children in Glasgow are living in poverty. And at the same time, the city is truly struggling to grapple with the impact of climate change. The city is proposing to upskill its residents, especially those in impoverished areas, with design and innovation skills and link them with industry, business and academia to launch enterprising solutions with the overarching aim of eradicating poverty and addressing and responding to the climate emergency. And the challenge they've framed through this Bloomberg project is working on unleashing a neighbourhood-level participatory approach to community well-being. And they're doing this by establishing design hubs in the local community that upskill and train citizens with design thinking skills and knowledge to allow them to become problem solvers for the city, to play a key part in informing local policy and planning and make recommendations for how they would like change to be driven forward in their city moving forward, but in a very collaborative, co-designed and connected way. Another alumni from our Design Thinking Accelerator is Michelin Scotland Innovation Park. Now, Michelin was a tyre factory based in the city of Dundee that employed just under 1,000 people. Its closure had a really big impact on the city, and with the support of Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise and the Michelin Corporation, they forged a partnership to drive forward new plans for an innovation park, which responds to the climate emergency, focusing on people, place and planet. And they hope to use this innovation park to attract companies that are innovative and leading the way in sustainable mobility and decarbonisation, to develop new products and processes that will tackle the climate emergency head on, and also with the ultimate goal of recreating those job opportunities that were lost by the previous site closure. And another example is Helm or Haim. So in Dundee, some of the young citizens face uncertainty about where they're going to live, and they can end up at risk of homelessness. So Haim is a Scottish word for home, and not having a place to call home means it's almost impossible to focus on the other important things in life, from moving on with your education or holding down a job or a college placement. Without a home, everything falls apart. So Haim is a group of connected young people, all care-experienced young adults and professionals with the support of businesses who are from the Dundee community, and they have decided to get together to offer young people a brand new option if they are at risk of homelessness. So their key founding partners are Helm Training, which is an established young person's charity in Dundee, and Hillcrest Homes, which is one of Dundee's largest housing associations. And they've formed a youth-led charity, which is also supported by providing employment opportunities for care-experienced young people. And they have won support and funding to develop and co-design 30 new homes in the city for young people living in Dundee. And these young tenants will also be fully involved in decision-making and will be able to gain skills and work experience within this new organisation. And that's just a picture of the lovely team there that we've been working with. The final challenge from our Design for Business programme is the InGame project. So InGame is an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, funded up to £14 million. They are established to support the industrial strategy in the UK to drive forward and to support the creative economy by focusing on the gaming sector. And they believe that game design and game technology can make the world a better place. The virtual Healthy Neighbourhoods Challenge was launched last week in partnership with Nesta, which is also an organisation to drive forward change, social innovation change for the common good. And they're working with InGame to launch this joint challenge fund to address healthy neighbourhoods and using gaming and game technologies to better understand and solve the challenge of healthy living by promoting healthy food choices and helping Nesta to achieve its mission of adding 2 years of healthy life expectancy for 10 million people across Scotland and within the UK. So they're looking for advanced game design, game engineering, programming, and data analytics, and pushed a call out for up to £50,000 of funding for people to respond to this challenge. Within the challenge, they're looking for a new understanding to imagine or de-risk systems-level interventions that shift the dynamics within food environments to ensure healthy and appealing food options are accessible, that they're affordable for everybody, whoever they are, wherever they live. And there's synergies within systems thinking, design thinking, and some of the great insights shared by Bernard, and that they call out some key skills that they're looking for when people apply to this challenge fund, that it's about adaptability, agility, collaboration, curiosity, storytelling, and strategy. So thinking about the new skills of the design profession moving forward and how we grow and support that and the training that we support. I'm now going to move on to talk about some projects within the museum for the next part of the presentation. So this project, Sewing Box for the Future, explores how we might share skills and knowledge across generations to respond to the climate crisis, but also to extend the life of clothing. The complex problem of looking at fashion waste within the context of circularity, but also using our museum to facilitate a live research project and pop-up exhibition to facilitate a mainstream conversation around climate change through a focus on fashion. Now within circularity, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have been working with IDEO to drive forward a toolkit for circular innovation, and they've been running these co-lab models which are adapted and built around the Google Design Sprint model conceptualized by Jake Knapp. So they've been bringing key people together across the global fashion supply chain and using design thinking, design approaches, methods, and ways of working, and design sprints as a mechanism to rethink the future of fashion. So at the beginning of this project, we were provided an opportunity to be a participant within a collab, and that was a fantastic experience to start to work through different audiences, different people across the supply chain, but also start to question and challenge circularity and the future of fashion. The image on this, the building covered in garments, was from a project led by Marks and Spencer's, which is a UK clothing retailer. And they had this wonderful exhibition several years ago in London where they attached 10,000 garments to the exterior of a building, and that was to demonstrate how much clothing we throw away every 5 minutes in the UK alone. So it was quite a powerful entrance to an exhibition. And they also set up a swap lab, which was modelled around Apple's Genius Bar. So on the high street, there's a real challenge that there are very little service provisions for a fashion consumer beyond the point of purchase. And sewing skills are diminishing. They're no longer being passed on from one generation to the next. So within this project, we wanted to challenge and question that. We wanted to facilitate a mainstream conversation around it, but we also wanted to promote a call to action around the climate crisis, in that there is a crisis of waste in the global fashion industry, but what might we as individuals do about it? So we had a pop-up exhibition demonstrating the work of fantastic designers who were remaking using existing materials. We also identified that in an average wardrobe, 40% of clothing is not in circulation or in active use. So we developed a deck of 10 instructional activity cards that didn't require any expensive sewing equipment. Everything could be done with a needle and thread and some basic how-to and practical support and advice to allow people to bring that clothing, that 40% of clothing, back into circulation. This exhibition launched just before the pandemic, so we also had these lovely spaces in the museum where people could take a seat and they could have a go and they could practically prototype and try out these activities. We had to rethink the project through the pandemic, and we've then developed these takeaway kits that we also dispatched and shared with local community groups, providing them with all of the resources, the educational activities to enable them to have a go and to try it out at home with some support. And then talking about the spirit of design thinking, those to visualize and synthesize really complex information, we also started to produce infographics that talked about different fibres that make up the clothing in our wardrobes and the challenge of landfill, in that these mixed fibres, they cannot be easily recycled, and as a consequence, clothing made from mixed fibres can remain in landfill for hundreds of years. So a wool jumper with the natural fibre might decompose between 1 to 5 years, but by comparison, a mixed fibre jumper can take over 200 years, and a pair of trainers might be in landfill for over 1,000 years. So we use these infographics as provocations to facilitate conversations about the environment, the climate crisis, the role of design, but also the role of fashion, clothing, and the responsibility of all of us to raise awareness and to think about what we could do as individuals to push forward this message that collectively small, tiny acts do have the power to influence change. And we also had an interactive sewing table in partnership with London-based Stitch School. So this was a digitally printed textile stretched over a long table called a supper cloth, almost like a large-scale embroidery hoop, which allowed visitors to drop into the museum and to stitch into this dress, which was then produced afterwards. So facilitating co-design, but by inviting people from all generations, children as small as 3 to adults in their 80s, having conversations together and sharing a nostalgia around making, sewing, working together, but also sharing stories through making. And finally, we worked with a group of young mothers through a fantastic group called Kindred Clothing out in the city. So due to our museum's temporary closure throughout the pandemic, we unfortunately couldn't finish all of the dresses that we had ready to co-design and make. But we created a safe space for this group to come into the museum in pairs and to stitch into the dress. And you can see the one on the left-hand side that was finished by this group of young mothers. There was a qualification built in so that they had a recognised qualification for their participation. And there was also childcare support provided to make it easy, accessible and safe for these mothers to come into the museum with their children and for them to be cared for while this training took place. I'll just talk about some other projects being led forward by our learning team and my colleague Peter Nurek within V&A Dundee. So V&A Dundee have also worked with Macmillan Daycare at Roxburgh House, which is a care centre for those living with cancer. And V&A commissioned designers to work with 20 people in Roxburgh House who receive care or who work at the Macmillan Day Centre to guide them through an interior design process in a bid to make the rooms in the building more functional, but also designed with their needs at the heart. So with the help of professional designers, the patients and the staff, they started to develop new ideas for this space. And they facilitated conversation. Lots of tea and biscuits were provided to create this safe, friendly space and to facilitate conversations, to identify what would make this a comfortable, safe and welcoming space for these patients and the service users who come into Roxburgh House. There was also funding put aside from NHS and Tayside in Scotland to then bring these ideas into fruition and to make them a reality. So building on these ideas, running a lot of these sessions, there was then resource in place to action the ideas. And it was all about storytelling and people having a voice and using co-design to action a wish about what they wanted in the future and how this space would really support them. And also within V&A Dundee's community programme, a lot of this learning has been expanded upon to create a co-design toolkit to enable similar projects to happen in the future. So all of these projects, the learning is documented and shared, and it is about creating shared resources or assets that can be shared outside of the museum, but also internally within our staff and all of our teams and departments too. And this was expanded upon throughout the pandemic. Our Mary Quant exhibition, an iconic fashion designer, did a lot of work in the 60s and 70s, and there was a lot of people that really wanted to come and see that exhibition, but unfortunately it wasn't safe for them to come into the museum. They had to isolate, and also care homes were very badly impacted throughout the global pandemic. And we developed, our exhibitions teams did virtual tours that they talked people through and took them on virtual tours around the museum, but also visual assets were packaged up and shared to allow people to experience that remotely in a safe environment. So taking the museum outside of its walls too, and making that a safe space, and also a way for patients and people living in their care home to ask questions and to engage in those conversations too. And then finally talking about our community garden. So the community garden was designed to be a space and a place outside of the museum, a civic space for citizens to use, but it was co-designed by people living with and recovering from health and well-being issues. So the garden was designed to be a safe space and a welcoming space for them and also for visitors to use, but it was also designed to be an extension of V&A Dundee, providing a space for outdoor talks and programmes and events. And we've used a lot of these assets, so you can see this laser cut little sign here was used again to capture stories, to allow people to share what they would like this place to be and their wish for this space moving forward. And a lot of sessions were also done by our freelance designers to co-design spaces and to provide residents and stakeholders or users in the city with the opportunity to be involved in an interior design process. My colleague Peter, who led this project, said that garden design is a fascinating area which can have very significant benefits for anyone's health and well-being. And the design health and well-being, particularly for people managing a range of mental health issues. And the design process that the group has undertaken, it really gave them a sense of confidence in their abilities, as well as being a platform to showcase their own creative skills. And this is just a final image of the space that they co-designed by working together. At the end of 2019, just before the pandemic, our learning team also worked on a national schools design challenge, working with 5 schools across Scotland. And the purpose of the design challenge was to respond to the Scottish Government strategy for a connected Scotland. So asking school children to design new solutions to alleviate isolation and loneliness in their school and their school communities, with the provocation or the question, how can we or how might we reduce loneliness and isolation in our school? And they were supported through a series of design jams and workshop sessions to use design as a tool for social change. And these pupils were encouraged to work together to find solutions that address issues directly affecting them. And you can see they started to prototype and work up solutions moving forward. The design sprint saw each team or a series of teams work creatively with a professional designer. And the professional designer supported the pupils and the children in their team to use the design process and a range of different materials to start to prototype and to develop new ideas to make their solutions tangible. The pupils were also filmed chatting about what they liked about their idea, how they came up with their idea, what it was like working with a designer, so also reflecting on that co-design experience. And at the end of each design jam, the teams presented to a group by discussing the process, the solutions, and the designs that they created. So they did this excellent job, and I think reflecting on future leaders or future leaderships, these skills or these design skills really add value in this space, that using our imagination and creative problem solving to enable young people to play a key role in shaping learning experiences and to be our future leaders for tomorrow. So the final project I'm going to talk about is What If Scotland, which is an exhibition that we currently have on within V&A Dundee. It was supposed to go to Venice, but due to the pandemic, that wasn't possible. So we're very grateful that we could host it here. And the project was led by 7 architects, responding to the theme for the Venice Biennale about how might we live together. So it seeks to re-engage the civic role of architects and designers by asking citizens from across Scotland to share their hopes and dreams for the future of the places they call home. At the start of 2020 and prior to the first nationwide lockdown, 7 paired with 25 people from 5 places across Scotland with 25 designers, architects and artists to share their hopes and dreams for the future of the places they wanted to live in. And the architects and designers then used these wishes to begin to explore imaginative ideas in response to the community challenges being faced. Now, this collaborative process has been captured in a series of short films in the exhibition to build a narrative around the stories of each place. And it's also told by citizens themselves, set within the rich and varied landscapes of rural and urban Scotland, and presented as an immersive environment designed for reflection and inspiration. So there's also a wishing well within the exhibition to propose a question to the visiting public or audience. What is your wish for your local community? What is your wish for your professional practice? And how might design, creativity and culture make a difference? The wishing well in the exhibition has captured visitors from all over the world, from a diverse audience, from tiny children right through across multiple generations. And this data and information captured will be really valuable moving forward in these civic wishes. And this morning there was a final session, a workshop session with young people from schools and local communities across the city, with designers and with local leaders working in partnership to expand upon What If. And they started to explore ideas to inform future policy, future practice, and also to make recommendations for Dundee, our local city in Scotland. We're blown away with the professionalism of these young people, all generations coming together to have a voice, to influence and to make recommendations for what assets to address challenges, what assets are needed to address challenges in these local communities, and to discuss what change might be needed to drive forward to inform how these assets might be used and how they're used well. Young people calling out that it isn't about parachuting in, that there needs to be longer term conversations, that collaborative decision making is essential, and we need ongoing support to drive forward meaningful change. So some closing thoughts from this presentation: that design is an act, it's about purposeful, creative problem solving, and it's a lot broader than any of us who calls ourselves a professional designer. Design is about everyday lives, and good design thinking is an act, and a purposeful, creative problem solving needs to be meaningful, it needs to be relevant, and it needs to add value. It's also about using creativity to give everyone a voice. So good design thinking facilitates conversations. Now, these conversations can now be hybrid, they can be online, they could be offline. We have new platforms like Miro or Mural, alongside workshops with physical assets and materials that we can use as mechanisms to document and to capture and to facilitate stories. Never underestimate the power of a prototype. This makes things tangible, it makes things real, and it has the real potential to bring abstract ideas to life. And then finally, a really key point, building upon the work of the Design Council that Bernard shared, it's about evidence and impact. We need to get better at capturing data, at capturing stories and insights, and also crafting these stories into new representations to really influence and drive forward change. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Bali, for your presentation. That was really insightful as well, and I'm really interested to see all the work that the V&A does using design as a narrative. We would like to open up the questions from the audience as well, so you can write them down in Spanish or in English, and we can make them to Dr. Bali. I can start with one of my questions, if we can. Yes, thank you. I think I found really interesting all of the activities that you showed us from the Design Thinking Accelerator, and then all of the activities from the museum as well. And I was wondering if you do any kind of follow-up of how people do keep using those skills, either in their businesses or in their life, in their everyday activities.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. We do a lot of follow-up. So we've done a lot of consultation, going out and chatting to the Design Council or others who support design-led training or support. And we have an evaluation logic model for our programme using theory of change. And within there, we have 4 key components that we are building data around to evidence and to understand the stickability or the broader application of these tools beyond our training, to also grow and learn so that our programme is reacting and responding to feedback from our alumni. A key piece of feedback is that training is easier to drive forward a culture or a practice if you attend as a pair or as a team. So we create opportunities for people to attend that training in their teams, if that's possible, so that they have a peer when they go back into their organisation. But we also go back, we have telephone calls. Prior to the pandemic, we would go out and spend time in the organisation to do some observational work. And we're also keen to drive forward more of an ethnographic approach, where people are telling us these stories and we're documenting them so it's more human and connected, and they have voice in sharing their experience too.
That's very interesting. And how do you identify those businesses that want to participate? So do you do like an open invitation, or do you go to some local businesses that you know?
It's a varied approach. So we work in partnership with our local business chamber of commerce. We have a steering and advisory group that has representation from different business organisations and associations across the country. We attend business breakfasts, accelerator events. So we share our resources and we build a waiting list. We also try to create a safe space, so we would never have a business from a similar sector, there might be competition or a competing marketplace or proposition. But we also try to mix it in the sense that we would have public sector, a global corporate, a new startup, and SME, all in an accelerator together. So there's people with varying levels of expertise and from different places of the market. And that's been a real consistent piece of feedback that people have got value from that, being part of such a cohort.
Thank you. Catherine, do we have any questions from the audience yet? Not yet. Okay. Okay. I don't know if I can ask this, but I want to ask if you have like fixed resources to do all these activities, or is it a mixture of different funding projects, or how do you get the resources to do all of this?
There's different. So there's a little bit. We have we try to provide our training program for our design thinking accelerator. We do have a little bit of funding to support our public program to allow us to do that. We also apply for funding. We pursue research council funding. We work in partnership with other organisations to share resources. So there's not one approach, there's several approaches. And within the museum, we have a partnerships and philanthropy team that working with different funding models for different pieces of programme. And the evaluation is written into that so that we are capturing the difference those pieces of programme have made to those who engage.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Bali, for your presentation. I think it was very interesting as well, and very insightful. And thank you for joining us. And we'll hope to see you soon here at Cátedra Europa and at Universidad del Norte.
Thank you so much for your time and the opportunity. Take care.
Thank you.
We thank you. We thank our guests, our attendees. This was a great session. We invite you tomorrow for the second delivery of the impact, the impact of design beyond objects, which is going to be at the same time. We also invite you to continue supporting the education of more talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donations button on the homepage of the Cátedra Europa platform. We also encourage to stay connected to the rest of the events that we have for you today, and we want you all to have a good day. Thank you so much.